So Perry, some of the questions that are coming through are asking for a little bit more specifics. So in relation to actually what you did within your district, when you had them review and refine their assessment and evaluation protocols and think about what types of new assessments they might need, what were some areas that you felt you had good assessments, either general ed or special ed assessments or protocols within your district, and what are some areas that, given the feedback you got from your staff, you thought that something more in-depth was needed? Because you described it as making sure that the focus of the assessment was in relation to the area of suspected disability, but you referenced it as going deep in terms of the assessment. Can you give us a little bit more information on that?
So it really is related to the reading evaluation, a really comprehensive reading evaluation. So looking at the areas of reading is, really looking at the assessment in terms of what is it that the student really needs support in. Is it phonemic awareness, phonics, or fluency? What is the part of any evaluation or any assessment that's holding the student back from being able to comprehend, which is the ultimate goal of reading? So looking at very targeted areas of, phonological processing, decoding, spelling, fluency, and without naming specific assessments, there's many assessment tools out there that really get at, reading rate, accuracy, fluency, decoding, word decoding, sentence decoding, non-words, all of those areas. So it really was not just give, a broad-based, broad reading test that encompassed a couple of subtests, but do that and really go deeper, not in the area of comprehension, but in the area of phonemic awareness, phonics, or fluency. And there's many tools out there that get at exactly those areas. And in our district, we needed to purchase, I believe, 2 additional assessments that the district did not have, that I felt were important to give a better understanding of what the students' actual needs were in those areas.
Margie, can you add? Thank you, Perry. Margie, can you add anything to that?
I think Jewel and I were just exchanging glances here. We have purposely avoided naming specific assessments and programs, but we can make some of that information available. And I think that's the best way to handle it, because we don't want to omit anything. By calling out 1 or 2, we may, omit. So I'd rather be comprehensive in naming specific tools later, when we've had a chance to discuss it at greater length.
And I think as an independent evaluator, the most important element of identification is the critical reasoning skill of that team. Yeah. And so it's really not a measure that's going to identify. It's how your team puts all of that information together to make an informed decision about the student. So I don't want people to get stuck on what measure should I give. A lot of times the district want to know from me, tell us what measures we should be giving to students, and I can't, because it depends on the referral questions. So don't get too hung up on picking the right measure.
Yeah, that is such an important point. I think it also applies to interventions. So people get hung up on what intervention. The most important thing is that teachers get, the information, the knowledge, and have had adequate opportunities to apply that knowledge. So it's really more about how that information is used and discussed programmatically and with the team.
So this really gets us back to the real heart and soul of the assessment process, or the evaluation process, which is hypothesis testing, right? So coming up with The reason for a referral leads you to questions about a student, and that should lead you logically within your team to figuring out how you assess and how you really dig deep, as Perry said, to answer some of those questions without always giving a standard type of protocol and reporting standardized tests, which may not give you the real information that you need.
That's right, and the other thing to consider is that, you know, identification is one piece of serving students with dyslexia. As Margie said, the intervention is most important. So when you're developing your assessment protocols in your district and your menus of assessment protocols, I want you to think about creating a balance of assessments that are both standardized norm reference and informal diagnostic, because it's the informal diagnostic assessment that will allow your team, if they're appropriately trained to do so, to develop individualized scope and sequence of instruction for students, and to also to develop informed progress monitoring plans for the students. Your standardized norm reference assessments won't serve that purpose.
Yeah, and just a follow-up to that, you know, while you have to have those standard scores, what you really want to do is look at the responses that the student has given you on some of those specific items, and you're really looking analytically at the errors that the students are making to inform, first of all, what the identification should be, but equally important, what recommendations you would make in terms of the instruction that students should receive.
Thank you. That's a good discussion on that topic. A big question we're getting has to do with the students who are already identified as having a specific learning disability. And it's sort of an, what do we do now? The question specifically is, should we as a district reevaluate our students with SLD to determine if they fit that subcategory of dyslexia? So we're going to start with Pat, and then we may turn it over to Perry from a district perspective, and ladies, jump in.
So there's also a related question that says, if a student is identified with dyslexia, but the box that is checked as specific learning disability, should we amend the IEP? And I think in general, you have to remember, as everyone has said here, that it's the instruction and the progress of the student that is paramount in any kind of identification here. Whether one box is checked or the other box is checked, or one identification is made or the other identification is made, if the student's strengths and weaknesses have been appropriately identified and the instruction is targeted to those weakness areas, and the child is making success, there may not be a need to go forward and change the primary disability box. However, I would say if that is something that team wants to do and the child is making progress, I would wait till the next annual review before changing the primary disability in that process. If a child is not making progress, it may be that further evaluation information is warranted, and so holding a PPT to decide what further information is needed, looking at the child's progress or lack of progress, and changing that identification may be appropriate. So there really isn't any one answer. Kind of a related question to that is, what is the frequency and duration of interventions that should happen before a child is identified either as specific learning disability or having dyslexia? And the answer to that is it depends. It depends on if there's fidelity of instruction, if the instruction has been targeted appropriately, if the child is making progress, what type of progress. And certainly you don't want a child in scientific research-based intervention for 2 or 3 years before you look at further in-depth evaluation. There's a couple of other related questions, and then I'll let my colleagues chime in. There's a couple of questions about the SLD worksheets, particularly the multidisciplinary evaluation report form. Those are for specific learning disability, of which dyslexia is a type of learning disability. Those forms are still good and in place and should be used even if you're identifying a child as having dyslexia. We will probably look at those forms and tweak them or modify them to include dyslexia a little bit more specifically, but they are still appropriate to be used. The last question I have here that I want to address is, should a child be on an IEP or a 504 if the child has a disability, a dyslexia, a phonological, but is on grade level according to benchmarks and assessments? This is one of the profiles that I mentioned that we would probably be looking at down the road. If a child has received appropriate instruction and they have a diagnosis of dyslexia or even specific learning disability and they are functioning on grade level, yes, they could still have the diagnosis because, as we've mentioned before, fluency is a huge issue and they may need extended time in order to be able to cope with their current learning demands. So in that case, it might be appropriate, since specialized instruction in the area of reading might not be necessary or any other area, but they may need an accommodation of extended time, so a 504 plan might be appropriate.
And that specifically speaks to some of our older students.
Yes.
Yes. Anything to add to that?
I could just add, that's good advice, Pat, around reevaluation. One of the things that did happen in my district was that we had, obviously we were going through this process with my staff, their greater understanding of it and new learning, and I happened to be at a PPT. It wasn't even a PPT that I, was intentionally that. I happened to be the administrator facilitating, and a conversation came up around dyslexia, and it was kind of, I took it as an opportunity to really kind of, see where the team was going and see where the parent was going. And ultimately, the student already had an SLD in reading. And ultimately, we ended up deciding as a team that we were going to do some additional evaluation, additional assessments, measures on this student to see whether he should be identified as having dyslexia. And in fact, it turned out that we did the additional measures, and the PPT decided that this was appropriate, and it was appropriate to identify. Now, the impact was so little on this particular case because the student was receiving terrific instruction and had made some really good progress. An older student had been making some very good progress, so it was really just a matter of tweaking, and it was, a student that, the kind of instruction that they need typically doesn't go on in, at that level, and we actually did have it going on, and we just made some tweaks to the program. So that's just one example of, it happened, and so it's really, it was our first particular case that we, actually managed this process. And really, the SLD identification is a key indicator, and clearly through looking through the file, you could see all the areas were the areas that we're all speaking about today, that he was having difficulty with, no other area. So it was just one example of, how we've handled it in our district.
So we would like to hear from any of you if you have any additional questions about the specifics of the students that you already have identified in your district, procedurally what you would do. So please give us those questions, and we'll try to answer them within the next few minutes. I would like to go back because we have some questions still related more to the content areas of reading. And a question came up about the public perception of dyslexia, which in some circles is still referred to as letter reversals or word reversals. So we're going to turn that over to our content experts to talk about this, because it's important for families to understand this, but it's also important for educators to understand it so that they can explain it to families and reduce some of the myths that are out there.
Yes, and that is a common myth, and so it is a very important one to clear up. And what you've heard us say phonological probably 100 times today. So that's an important word to really understand. So phonological processing is processing the sound system of any language. As I mentioned, English, has lots of phonemes that don't correspond directly to one letter, so that makes it tricky. But the idea here is that these students are not seeing letters backwards. So the fact that they reverse letters, and that's sometimes common, and it might lead you to think that they're seeing the letters backwards or they're seeing words backwards. They transpose words. They put letters in the middle of words that aren't there, etc. There may be a visual perceptual component. We talked about dyslexia being complex, and there's no classic profile necessarily. So there could be a subset of these students who do reverse letters because of visual perceptual difficulties. Some dyslexics will describe that the words float around on the page. There are different treatments that have been used for these students, but there's no research to support these treatments. The treatment for a phonologically based reading disability, i.e. dyslexia, should be rooted in decoding and a code emphasis program on phonemic awareness as well. So that's important because parents, if you're listening on this webinar, you're looking for anything that will work for your child, and many parents have spent lots of money and resources on occupational therapy, or not occupational therapy, but visual therapy. There may be a component of visual perceptual problems that could be cleared up with this kind of approach, but it doesn't help the reading disability. It doesn't clear up the reading difficulty. So that's, I think, important to say. As far as reversing letters, children will do that up till about the age of 7, just universally. So it could be considered a red flag if a 9-year-old or a 10-year-old is constantly reversing the letters. But again, it's not because they're seeing those letters backwards. It has more to do with confusion of the sound and the corresponding letter. Anything to add to that, Jewel?
No, that's great. Thank you.
Another area of questions that we're getting is more in the area of interventions, again, specifically at the secondary level. And we know it becomes more difficult when you have students who are older middle school and high school age, and we want to make sure, as you've said before, Margie, that we want to make sure that they're getting the right type of intervention they need, and Jewel, you also said this, but maintaining their access to the rich content of high school. Any other suggestions for our districts in terms of interventions?
I think you have to keep in mind that even though these students are bigger, when we're talking about dyslexia and core deficits that are associated with students with dyslexia, it doesn't really matter what grade we're talking about. So you may have a student in high school who still needs very basic phonological interventions. The same kind of interventions that would be characteristic of core instruction, for example, in kindergarten or first grade, may need to be part of the intervention protocol for our high school student. The same thing goes for phonics. I happen to be more inclined to an approach than a program when it comes to phonics, so here's a disclaimer that this is my personal opinion, that approaches similar to Orton-Gillingham, which are systematic and explicit in nature, depending upon a teacher who is very knowledgeable and trained in systematic explicit instruction, can move older students faster than programs, because with an approach you can identify and develop an individualized scope and sequence of instruction for a student, whereby programs are going to require you to go through each step in sequence because each step builds upon one another. So in terms of phonics instruction for students who are at secondary level, you're really going to need to think about specialized training for your intervention team. Is it your special ed teacher or your remedial reading teacher? Just because you have folks who are credentialed doesn't mean that they have the requisite skill set necessary to teach phonics systematically and explicitly, especially when we're talking about advanced phonics concepts, including multisyllable word reading. That characteristically, believe it or not, is not part of any teacher's preparation program at the undergraduate or graduate level, even if we're talking about teachers who are earning their 102s in remedial reading and remedial language arts. So districts need to think about how it is that they're going to use professional development to shore up the expertise of the intervention teams around those core areas of phonology, phonics, and fluency.
And that's a very well articulated, Jewel. And I would just add to that that the challenge for high school students is to keep them motivated and to find materials that are appropriate for them to be reading. That's really important because you're not going to have them read text that was written for second graders. But you're going to want them to be developing those foundational skills that Jewel just described. And so you really have to think about that piece of it while building and continuing to expose them to the content knowledge.
There's just one thing I would like to add. This is Pat, and that is, having taught at the high school level for many, many years, when you have students who struggle with reading at the high school level who haven't been identified before, you may see more things like avoiding behavior and poor grades and attendance issues and those types of things. And one of the areas that I hear a lot about at the department are students who have behaviors and they're treated as behavioral issues without looking at the underlying academic difficulties. Sometimes a child who has an academic difficulty such as dyslexia, you won't see that, but you'll see all of the acting out behaviors, and you really need to look underneath those behaviors to see if there's an underlying academic area, particularly in the area of reading.
All righty, thank you. I think that we've addressed the major content themes in terms of the questions that have come through. So we may actually be ending a few minutes early. What I wanted to point out to you was that, sorry, Pat, you wanted to speak to resources.
I just wanted to say that we're getting a number of questions about specific areas such as math or dyscalculia or dysgraphia, which are both types of a learning disability, handwriting, et cetera, et cetera. This is not the focus of today's webinar to address these issues, but we will certainly look at resources in those other areas and post them at least on the CERC website so that people are developing a resource bank that they can draw from on that website.
That's great. So as we conclude today, I wanted to thank once again all of our presenters. Contact information for each of our presenters is on slide 81. Margie is literacy how, not learning how. We have a little typo there. But that lists direct emails for each of our presenters as well as websites. And so please feel free to contact people with questions if you would like. More general questions, if you would like to send them to Pat Anderson or to myself or to my co-facilitator, Steve Profit. We will get questions to the right people and get back to you with answers. Also in the PowerPoint towards the end, I forgot to mention, we do have a listing of all of the SLD Dyslexia Workgroup members. This work group will be meeting once again next week, and we are still working on some of the questions that you raised. So additional guidance will be coming forth from that work group to the State Department of Ed, and eventually will trickle down to you. So with that said, we would like your feedback. The last slide is our participant evaluation.